Hello, everyone, and welcome to Esoterica's The Interview. I'm Leah Eichler, and I'm here with Susan Catto, who I'm so thrilled to introduce because Susan is our new editor-in-chief. Yay, Susan!
I'm so happy to be a part of Esoterica.
No, Susan and if you've read our press release, Susan comes with some ridiculous background. I've known Susan for many, many years. We met at the Giller Awards, like what seems like a lifetime ago, and she was working for the New York Times. And then she since went to go work for Time Magazine, and then for The Economist, and just a whole lot of exciting things. And she has a PhD in English literature, just that. I mean, nothing else really. And it's from Oxford. Yeah, but other than that, she's just your average gal. So thank you, Susan, for joining us.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction.
We love you. Okay, so we're so happy to be back. It's been a few months. We're relaunching our interview. We're going to make it more talkative. We're going to bring in guests. We're going to talk about issues that are almost always pertaining to works of literature, to books, to pop culture, and where it intersects with books, and maybe what's happening in the news as it intersects with books and writing and big ideas. And we're going to start off today with the topic of what makes a good short story. So this is something Susan and I have been discussing quite a bit over the last little while, because we do have an award that we're running right now for a short fiction prize coming up next year. The entries are still open, so you can still apply, and we'd love to see what you have to submit. But what makes a good short story? I mean, what are your thoughts, Susan?
Well, I've been really inspired by reading a relatively recent book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain by George Saunders. George Saunders is himself a master of the short story, but he also is a teacher, and he's famed for his short story course focusing on Russian literature. So what he's done is a book that any aspiring writer or current writer should not miss, in which he essentially delivers his course. He publishes the story and breaks into it to give you his lessons about why this story works. And it gave me a whole new way of thinking about short story structure, because he sees formula and structure all over a good short story. And I think whether it's intentional or not, if you then look at the short stories that you love, you can't help but see that structure and formula. So I'm very interested how short story writers feel, whether they're building that into their stories as they work, whether it's something that emerges naturally. But when you read this book, you'll never, I think about it the same way.
So it's interesting because you mentioned structure. So I mean, as a writer, I think structure is such a fraught word because, obviously we use structure, but, there's like these preconceived ideas that books have to have like a certain pattern to make it successful, and short stories have a certain pattern to make it successful. And I mean, and writers do this all the time. The same short story patterns and novels play out again and again. Mm-hmm. And, of course, most artists, want to break the mold. And I'm guilty of that all the time. So, some of the actual points you mentioned from the George Saunders' book is when it comes to structure, he refers to it as like a form of call and response.
Yes.
So how do you interpret that?
So he basically says that a question arises in the story. Right. And that question can come from anything like your first line. As soon as you introduce somebody and something happens to them, there's a question. Right. The writer then considerately, the story must answer that question. And his line is, if we want to make good structure, we just have to be aware of what question we are causing the reader to ask and then answer that question. And then he adds jokingly, see, structure's easy.
You know what? Actually, that's true. I mean, it's funny, but it's also brilliant because, I'm a huge fan of opening lines. Opening lines are so important.
Yeah.
But also, this kind of helps explain, when we've been reading short stories, you and I have read many, many, many short stories over the last little while. One of my gut reactions is, there's seems to be two types. There's the ones that have the beginning, middle, and end, which I have to admit are the ones I prefer because I feel like they formalize the story. Then again, there are beautiful ones that are just like snapshots of a place or a time or an experience, which I also quite like. But that could answer your question. That could be the call and response. It's like you can have a snapshot of someone's life, but you need to know what the question is. You need to know what the answer is. I find sometimes like people they think that it's literary by actually just cutting off the ending and not, giving us the answer. But we want closure, right?
We do want closure. He says never don't make things happen for no reason.
Right.
And having made something happen, make it matter.
Yeah.
So, a lot of that kind of comes down to concision. There's no flab in a great short story, even though there might be plenty of detail, but it's all there to kind of make it happen. You're getting details that help the person visualize, the scene you're painting. And, it's these facts that kind of draw us in. I just think there's one other point that I really think is important is if you're one of those people that he just thinks all you need is a sentence to start.
Yeah.
And that you should just get your sentences down. But what separates writers who publish from writers who don't publish is a willingness to revise.
Well, yeah, we know about revisions. We revise a lot. Yes, we revise all the time. So I think that's important. I think writers should know that. Get your story out, get it on the paper, and then go back and fix it. You actually gave 2 examples earlier that I just want to bring up because, in short stories, I love that idea. And I think it works in long form as well, that everything has to be important. Like every character has to have an objective. Like every, description has to be relevant. What I love about short stories is you really need to cut the fat, and it can be an 8,000 word short story, but it still has to have all the important elements. And you mentioned just the facts versus descriptions. Mm-hmm. So, and as journalists that we are, facts are really interesting. So we say things like the car was dented in red versus just, it's not just describing, it's like they're facts about the car, which actually place us in that, in that world, right?
Yeah, it's a great way other than, you're not saying the car looked like it had been through, some pretty rough traffic right. with some dents on the side and scratches in its red paint. It's just just get it out there. It's fun fact because it's short stories that we're talking about,
right.
but one of my favorite details about The Great Gatsby, an incredible short novel, is
right.
that it was originally something like, 4 times the length of the published book. He wrote that book and then he just cut and cut and cut until every line is essential.
That I did not know that.
No, I didn't. I just really can't recommend. There's a great book about The Great Gatsby as well called Careless People that I would recommend as well. But for people who are interested in writing technique, I would say this George Saunders book is up there with the other book that I think is a must read, which is Stephen King's On Writing.
Yes, of course. It's a regular on my Audible. It's a great one too. Now, these are great tips. And if you're listening in, submit your story. We really cannot wait to read your stories. We're very excited about this contest. So we talked about a good short story, and now let's get to your expertise. So Susan wrote a big idea piece for Esoterica called "The Top 10 F-Boys of Classic Literature." And what I love about it, and this is a perfect Esoterica piece, is it mixes that really cerebral basis in literature, but also brings in, kind of a lightheartedness. I mean, not everything needs to be so serious. And when you think about it, do you want to define, I think our audience knows what an F-boy is, but, do you want to define F-boy for us?
Well, I was inspired by a show, and I will say, because I do have a PhD in literature, I feel I have an absolute right to do things like watch shows called F-Boy Island. And
you have total permission to write. Yeah, you can watch that. I can watch
that. So I did watch it,
yeah.
And it was very funny. It's quite a tongue-in-cheek version of a reality dating show, right. Where half of the men on the island are self-proclaimed F-boys who are just in it to score and to maybe get the cash prize at the end. And half of the guys are self-proclaimed nice guys. But the women, and there's 3 of them, don't know which is which. So that's the drama of that show. And that's okay. So an F-boy basically is someone who is really, really skilled with the majority of the opposite sex at charming them. Even if you don't want to like him, there's something about him that is fairly irresistible. And they can kind of handsome or talk, or in the case of this show, show off their core muscles or whatever to an extent that is hard to, that other men might find hard to compete with. And of course, men like this are not just that we see them in real life, but we see them in literature too. I was struck by how similar the experiences, apart from the shirtlessness, lined up with Jane Austen novels that I happen to be reading. So every Jane Austen novel has an F-boy, a character who poses a real threat to the women in the story, even as he adds that sex appeal and sizzle. So that's what I started looking at. I think Jane Austen, and as I explained in my piece, does this incredibly well, both mocking them, but also showing why they are so appealing to us. And you can think of obvious people like Wickham in Pride and Prejudice, or Willoughby in Sense and Sensibility is probably, the ultimate archetype. But I wanted to ask, I know you're a big fan of, Emily Bronte and so forth. So I want to take it beyond Austen and sort of say, who are some of these other F-boys of classic literature? Who jumps out to you?
Well, it's interesting because, I am. So, Susan and I have an ongoing feud of if Bronte is better than Austen. I come across, I do like Jane Austen. I really love Wuthering Heights. It's just one of my favorite books. But, I don't, and the thing that's interesting about Jane Austen, and if I have to generalize about her books, is that she has the 2 archetypes. So she's always comparing what I refer to as like the boring state kind of man, who turns out to be okay, maybe or maybe not, and, the very vivacious F-boy, let's call him, okay? Yeah. So, it's the 2, it's like, who do I pick? Let's go into, and it's almost the basis of every romance novel. Do I pick the hot, dangerous guy who may never settle down with me, or do I pick the tried and true guy? So, it is fascinating. I will say, I don't think Heathcliff is an F-boy. Let's just drop that. I think he's widely, because I think we need to differentiate between F-boys that are in it for the hustle and those that are just tragically flawed, because I don't think it's an intentional, I'm going to string you along intentionally. It's the tragic flaw, which in my mind is hugely appealing. Scotty's name on me, but I definitely like the tragically flawed. So I don't know. Let's talk about some of the other F-boys that are in classic literature. So, what other ones did you talk about in your article?
Well, I will say that prior to Jane Austen, it's not like the F-boy didn't exist. Yeah. He just wasn't maybe written as well. So, and authors that really influenced Jane Austen, Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding, who wrote right before Austen, they both had F-boys. In Richardson's case, anti-hero in Clarissa and Pamela. In Henry Fielding's case, a book like Tom Jones. Tom Jones is a classic F-boy. He's lovable. He's not trying to wreck anyone's life, but he just can't help it if women throw themselves at him. If you go even further back, you could say that Odysseus was an F-boy because, he's meeting, he's seducing, he's having no trouble with the ladies, and he's not especially bothered with the repercustions of that.
Right. No, I think that's really true. And you actually mentioned the talented Mr. Ripley. Let's go from book to film. Also one of my favorite and also very appealing F-boys in that one.
Oh my God, Dickie Greenleaf is, I think, especially as personified by Jude Law.
Right.
Again, archetypal F-boy. You want to be able to sort of go, I know what that guy's like. But even though you're like, I know what that guy's like, you're still like, wow, impressive. And I think that's why Jane Austen is so cool, because she doesn't actually have her, even her most sensible heroine will not be able to just completely dismiss and be disgusted by. She'll be like, I know he's an idiot, but you got to hand it to him. He's charming.
Right. Yeah. It's very true. It's very true.
I think great literature is littered by it. I would just, I would love to know what anyone watching this thinks about their favorite novel, who's the F-boy that they like in classic literature, or who's the, it's the scene stealers, really.
Right. Well, I mean, maybe people can write in and talk about who they think is their most revered or, most enticing F-boy in classic literature, even modern literature. It comes up, I think, we talk about, kind of stereotypical structures of, different, I mean, that's really that dichotomy of like the F-boy and the tried and tested and true man is really, it's very pervasive. I mean, it really is everywhere. And it's funny, I wonder if that's why we like shows like F-Boys so much, because it's rooted in what we've actually been reading all along. Maybe there should be like an F-Boy, a period piece, and they should place it in like,
that would be
19th century.
Well, there was an old motto, in Samuel Richardson's time, that a reformed rake makes the best husband. And he set out to disprove that because he thought it was a really pernicious myth that, kind of once an F-boy, always an F-boy. But on the show F-Boy Island, you have these guys who claim that they are reformed F-boys, and they are considered the big catch because they allegedly can offer the excitement while still being faithful and, husband material. None of it is fair. Most people cannot be divided into those categories, but it is a little bit of fun. And I think it's kind of fun to look at classic literature through this lens. I got a kick out of it.
Our audience will be able to read your full piece the next week or so. We'll be promoting it, and
maybe I'll follow it up with one on F-Girls of Literature. You never know.
Oh my God. There must be such a thing. Now I got to think about that one. So there's got to be an F-girl of classic lit too. And
no one's as kind to those women. They usually get much meaner names. Okay.
But maybe not nowadays. Okay, so let's move on to, we want to talk briefly about life in the newsroom, and we'll tackle this topic again once the book comes out. But Margaret Sullivan's Newsroom Confidential is coming out in October. And why don't you tell us a bit about Margaret Sullivan for readers who don't know?
Yeah, so she's worked in newsrooms for about 4 decades, and she started off at the Buffalo News. But most people will know her because she was appointed in 2012 as the public editor of the New York Times.
Right.
And that was in a role where she was then, in these very contentious times, talking about the actual reporting, how it happens. She was the one that people went to when they felt things were unfair, when they felt there was fake news, unethical practices. She was addressing all these journalistic issues. So the book is a bit about navigating the controversies at the New York Times. So I'm really looking forward to reading that. But I also think it's interesting that she's writing about life in a newsroom and battling sexism in a newsroom. And I thought of you, Leah, because you used to run a newsroom at Reuters. So I just thought it might be a great one for you and I to talk about.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, it's been a few years since I've worked in a newsroom full time, although, I've never left journalism per se, but, the kind of the sad state of journalism, why public editors are so interesting to me is, in the last 10, 15 years, journalism has taken such a hit. I feel like the reputation, I feel like, and maybe you as well, we kind of grew up in what I now refer to in my mind as like the golden years of journalism, when people still trusted the news, or at least not everyone did, but more people did than do now. And for those that are unfamiliar with the profession, rest assured there is a very extreme code of conduct that goes into every newsroom, and they're meticulous. And sometimes people don't make mistakes, not like people don't have biases, but really, really good newsrooms will do their best to keep all those at bay. And it's been really sad to watch, the news disintegrate over the last 10, 15 years with statements like fake news, which now, has made everyone really, disprove everything. I mean, you can't really there's really no reliability, and people don't know what to rely on anymore, which I think is a really, really sad state of affairs, and of course, a major hit to our democracy. But when we talk about newsroom sexism, yes, I mean there was a ton of sexism. When I started, there were almost no women in the newsroom, at least the newsrooms I worked in. I'd say maybe less than 30% were comprised as women, and I do remember the boys taking trips to strip clubs and being called the girl. And things like that. And I'm sure that's still pervasive. And I mean, newsrooms and media companies, as we know, it hasn't really changed. We have our own kind of, for those who've been following the news, we, at CT, there's a whole brouhaha at CTV over Lisa LaFlamme, who was, by all appearances, unceremoniously dismissed because potentially ageism, potentially sexism, potentially gray hair. I mean, there's a whole litany of things, but what we can't dispute is that she was a top-notch journalist that was still in her prime. And we don't know why she was dismissed, really, and we probably will never really know. But I think sexism is still there. Well, I mean, I think it's still very pervasive, and it's a shame. Well, I mean, what do you think, Sue?
I think, my mother worked in newsrooms in Detroit and then in Toronto at the Globe and Mail. And for her, her career was expected to be over when she had children. So she, she got married, and it was basically like just a given. You don't continue working once you start a family. So that was kind of the end of her newsroom experience. But prior to that, it was just a given that you were one of the very few. You were subject to, quite a lot of belittling. You were, your work was relegated to women's sections of the newspaper, and but for all that, it's still.
Well, I don't think it's changed. I don't know. Maybe it's changed now, and of course, we can go into a whole long debate on what it means to be a feminist now. But I am obviously not the same generation as your mom, but I had my first child in 18 years ago, and I was also asked at the time if I would be coming to work after my mat leave, and I remember thinking it was the most puzzling thing. I'd spent my life trying to get that job, and why wouldn't I come back? I had no intention of staying at home forever with my kids, but of course in Canada we're lucky to have the option, but no, I definitely want to go back. So I'm curious how it is right now. Maybe people write in and tell us their worst sexism stories in their media outlets. I'm sure there are many of them, and we can report on them later.
Absolutely.
And so, final topic of the day is it's the 40th.
45 years now.
Oh, 45 years. My mistake. 45 years since The World According to Garp was first published. Now, Sue, you read this as a teeny tiny girl. What were your first impressions of the book? So
I have always felt that permanently life scarred by reading The World According to Garp way too young. I probably read it shortly after. I would have read it after the paper book edition came out, so I would have been maybe a tween. So inappropriate. It was my first encounter with so many things. But boy, did it ever make an impression. And I've always read a lot of John Irving novels ever since. And I do think it's a really significant book in literature that has never really, it was so ahead of its time.
It really was so ahead of its time. I know. So, I mean, and you interviewed John Irving. Actually, I interviewed him years later. So I think around, I don't know when did you interview John Irving?
I love it. I interviewed him in his home in Vermont when his novel, it would have been about 7 or 8 years ago.
Okay.
It would have been probably, his last novel was 7 years ago. So I think it was a novel before that. So it might have been even a little bit before that. Because he's now publishing his first novel in 7 years in October.
Right.
It's called The Last Chairlift. He's 80
Right.
years old now. So I'm quite curious to read that. I found him absolutely fascinating to meet. And the thing I found the most interesting was his compulsion to write. You would think there's an Oscar statuette in his bathroom from the movie, the screenplay of, that he wrote for Cider House Rules, I think. And he's such a bestseller. His house had all the framed, New York Times bestseller list. Could he relax and chill? No, he could not. He was every day driven to write, every day, all day. And I just thought, his poor wife, like he's never satisfied.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a writer's life, right? I mean, you do, it's like more of a madness than anything else. I mean, you kind of have to get it out there. I mean, or else it's like write or die, really. That's how I think a lot of us feel.
100%.
He just does it so much better than so many of us. So, yeah.
He reminds me, again, like Stephen King, again, is one of those people. He's going to write every single day. And John Irving is like every day. It was Christmas, no exceptions. Like he writes every day. So I think it's so interesting. I think I've heard there's going to be that he's written a mini series version of The World According to Garp, like for television now. So that's kind of something I would love to see. How
just read that today when I was looking, and that would be really exciting. So questions for you. And I actually did interview him. I think it must have been years before you did. And it was a very brief interview, and on his home was in Toronto. It was on the release of his book Until I Find You, which is still a book I love. And those of you who haven't read it, it is a fabulous story. And I realized, speaking of The World According to Garp, is he does have a lot of single mothers in his book. I mean, he was the child of a single mother. And I guess the question comes out now because, things have changed, and he was ahead of his time. I think at the time of World According to Garp, there was no debate that he was a feminist writer. So would you still consider him a feminist writer is the question. Now, in 2022, is he a feminist writer?
It's really hard to say because, The World According to Garp starts off, as I recall, because I've been too traumatized to go back and reread it, starts off, as I recall, with all kinds of descriptions of the young character looking at porn. And so it's dissections of these pornographic photos.
Right.
Didn't feel especially feminist to me, but in the humanity that he gives, the mother in that story, the single mother, the agencies that she takes for her life, and then the way he engages with with transgender issues, with the feminist issues, this whole society of women who cut off their tongues, in sympathy with a rape victim who has her tongue cut off. There's a lot that's engaged in there. I would be shocked if he, wasn't one of the more feminist male writers of his era, for sure. I don't. If you compare him to, someone like Updike or whatever, you're gonna. I know he's a little younger there, but if you compare, I don't think his characterization of females, they really are treated as like real, fully rounded people.
They are. No, it's true. So we will talk more about that in the coming weeks. And I want everyone to tune in next Tuesday. This will be a regular Tuesday session. We will have guests. We will have different topics. You can call in or post in, whatever it is, and engage with us. And we're really looking forward to making the interview something that our readers will really cherish and look forward to. And the last ditch reminder, I know we said at the beginning, is we do have a short story contest running right now, so you can submit your short story. Susan and I will be reviewing them. There are blind submissions. Anyone can submit. We, new writer, experienced writer, you name it, we are open to reading your lovely words. I wanted to thank you guys all again for tuning in. My name is Leah Eichler. I'm with Susan Catto. We are from Esoterica, and we will see you next Tuesday. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.